Thank you very much, and thank you to the organizers of the conference. It's the last talk was so interesting. I'm really excited to be here this morning. So my name is Kate Schoenecker. I'm a research ecologist, and I studied in this area for my PhD research in the San Luis Valley, and I'm glad to be here today to talk to you about plants and how they respond or how they tolerate removal of plant parts by elk and bison through herbivory. So just as a little bit of background, grazers co-evolved with the grasslands in North America about 20 million years ago. And it's thought that due to this coevolution, that grazing may actually enhance vegetation in some ways. So this concept of plant tolerance, which is what I want to talk about, is defined as the capacity of plants to reduce the effects of herbivory on their fitness. So how do they respond to literally having their leaves all ripped off? And it's linked to the idea of plant compensation. When plants compensate for herbivory, it's essentially the physiological capacity of plants to recover from that damage and to continue to perform the vegetative and reproductive functions. So we can look at this in terms of this graphic that was published way back in 1981. And if you look at the left side of that curve on the y-axis, it says effect on NPP. NPP is the primary productivity. So net primary productivity. So this is production. How much do plants produce in a year? And if you look across the x-axis, it says increasing grazing intensity. So essentially, as grazing intensity increases, it starts off, if you follow the curve, that plants actually start to be enhanced by that grazing, and they have higher productivity and higher nitrogen in their leaves. And then it reaches a point at the top there, the top of the curve, where grazing then starts to be, perhaps we would call it overgrazing. And those plants then start to not respond as well until they get down to like no response at all, which is, as much as being eaten as being tolerated. But then when you go below that zero line, that's where we see really deleterious effects from herbivory. So animals that are grazing are having damaging effects to those plants. And we can look at this in terms of the entire ecosystem or specific habitat types or vegetation communities. So the idea of this grazing optimization hypothesis is that grazing optimization predicts that some measures of plants' performance, and I'm going to talk to you about productivity and nitrogen content in the plants, are optimized at intermediate levels of consumption. So the thing about plants is that they vary in the degree to which they can compensate for losses to herbivores. Arid ecosystems are particularly challenging because of the high temporal variability in moisture inputs. And what this can do is uncouple the feedbacks between plants and herbivores, because really the plants are more hungry for water than they are, we can't read what the herbivores are doing because of the water situation. So what I really set out to figure out is under what conditions can plants compensate for tissue loss from herbivory in the San Luis Valley? And this is really another way to test for overgrazing. So how are plants responding to this defoliation by herbivores? The reason that this matters is because the Park Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service and all these agencies who manage public lands, they have to know what's going on, and they have to know if there's too many ungulates and if it's having deleterious effects on these plant communities. So my study was a long time ago. It was back 2005 to 2008, and we only recently published some of this work, but some of you will recognize this map. I had two really different study areas. One of them was an area on the Baca National Wildlife Refuge and within Great Sand Dunes that only had elk. So all the white areas were part of the study area. And you can see the little dots. They're either diamonds or squares or circles that were my various vegetation study sites that were in those areas that only have elk. Then I also looked at areas and compared them, areas with elk and bison. Inside the Medno Ranch, there are bison. And so that is a fenced area. The elk are able to get through that fence. And so there's elk inside the ranch as well. And you can see along Big Spring Creek and Sand Creek and Little Spring Creek that are located inside the Medno Ranch. They're labeled there. That those were also some of my vegetation sites. So the sites I looked at were herbaceous riparian areas, willow areas, and then these what we called meadow areas. And essentially I compared the areas with and without bison. At the time of our study, there were about 1,500 bison on the Medno Ranch and about 4,500 elk in this greater Great Sand Dunes area. So what I measured was, with a lot of help from volunteers and field technicians, we measured herbaceous production, offtake using clipping rings and long-term exclosures that are shown in the photographs there. So offtake is just the consumption. How much are the ungulates removing? And then nitrogen yield, which is basically the nitrogen concentration of the plants times the production. So N yield is giving us an idea of how much nitrogen is in those plants. And then we compared data from the 2 years that we took a lot of measurements, 2006 and 2008, and compared between the two ungulate strata, which is the elk-only areas versus elk plus bison. We identified overcompensation, undercompensation, and equal compensation by plants in these different vegetation communities. So overcompensation means that plants were actually enhanced by grazing, and they showed increased productivity or increased nitrogen in their leaves than compared to plants in the same area that were not grazed. And then undercompensation is when plants don't perform as well. This is where we know there's overgrazing because the plants are not responding and they're actually being suppressed. And then we also looked at equal compensation to see where there were areas where the plants were producing the same, whether they were grazed or not grazed. And then we compared these results to other well-studied temperate and tropical grazing ecosystems in order to draw broader inferences about these plant communities to compensate for grazing pressure. And the idea here is that if we can look at the Great Sand Dunes ecosystem and compare it to the Serengeti in Africa, compare it to Yellowstone National Park, and look at what the grazing levels are and what the production levels are, we can get an idea of how we compare to some of these other very long-term, very well-established and I would say successful grazing ecosystems that have been around for eons. So this also gives us a metric to compare offtake levels and sustainability of grazing with these other systems to the Great Sand Dunes ecosystem. So I'm going to start off right away by talking about results. We found that nitrogen content in all of the plants that we measured was consistently higher in the grazed sites. What that suggests is that they were actually being enhanced by the grazing. And if you look on the left, you can see there's a vegetation community. I'm showing you results from herbaceous riparian areas and willow communities. We measured these sites in 2 different seasons to see if there were differences by season. And overall, almost all of the areas that were grazed, whether it's in elk bison areas or elk only areas, or even both strata pooled, we typically had higher nitrogen in the plants in the areas that were grazed than the areas that were not grazed. The ones that I have circled for you in orange, those are the ones that were statistically significant. We always have like sample size stuff going on, and we weren't able to detect a significant difference, but just the quantitative difference was higher almost across the board, but it wasn't statistically significant in some of our sites. Another thing that I want to show you is the relationship between above ground net primary production of grazed versus ungrazed communities. So this again is trying to get you to see where we have overcompensation, where we have undercompensation, and where we had equal compensation would be really along that line. So here we are looking at the elk only sites and the elk and bison. The reason we're looking at both elk and elk plus bison sites is to get an idea of how much does it alter the system when you add another large herbivore to that community. how, is that tipping the edge and turning it into like a overgrazing situation? So what we found when we did a regression with the productivity in the grazed areas on the y-axis and the productivity in the ungrazed areas on the x-axis, you can see this line, and anything that's above that line is considered overcompensation because grazing actually enhanced those plants, and anything underneath that line represents undercompensation. So here I'm showing you there are many, many sites in both elk only and elk and bison areas that had where the plants were not only tolerating elk and bison grazing, but they were actually overcompensating for it, and they were enhanced by that grazing. We had a few that had equal compensation, and then there are a couple sites that were undercompensating. Those particular areas seem to be undergoing excessive grazing, and they didn't respond in the same way that the rest of the communities did, or the rest of the sites within those communities. We did find that all herbaceous riparian sites were substantially more productive when they were grazed, and except for one site. And then the willow communities were less productive, and they were grazed less than herbaceous riparian sites. And that's partly because these were lower productivity sites in the where there are willows. Here, the grazed primary productivity was more similar to ungrazed. So we saw more what we call equal compensation in those areas. Here I'm just showing you the slope of the line where you have ungulate consumption on the left and herbaceous, this is all herbaceous production on the x-axis. So if you look at ungulate consumption on the y-axis, you can see this is in grams per meter squared. And as herbaceous production goes up, the grazing goes up. But what's interesting, and what I really want you to get out of this, is that you have this certain slope. Okay, so this slope tells us something about the relationship between how much consumption is happening relative to how much production is on the landscape. This slope is very important because this is the slope of each of these lines. This is what's going to allow us to compare our ecosystem here in Great Sand Dunes with other big ecosystems across the globe. And the other interesting thing about this graphic is it shows you that when you add bison, you do have greater levels of removal due to the addition of that second herbivore, large herbivore, but it doesn't, it's still not deleterious. Okay, so here, and I only have a couple of like sciencey graphic slides like this, but I do think they're very interesting. Here we're comparing the relationship between Great Sand Dunes with Yellowstone National Park. And when we talk about these two different ecosystems, we also want to separate by elk only, the areas with elk and bison. And then I'm showing you data from Yellowstone National Park when bison were very abundant from 2012 to 2014. And then when Yellowstone were, in Yellowstone, when elk were very abundant from 1988 to 89. When at this point, back in the 1980s, bison were being heavily culled in the park. And so this is what changed later. So if you look at the slopes of these different lines, you can see that in Great Sand Dunes, which is shown in red and blue, the slope of both of those lines is very similar. We just know that there's a little bit more offtake when you add that second herbivore, but proportionally, the slope is the same, and proportionally, they're taking about the same. So, but when you look at the slope of this line from Yellowstone, when bison, now that bison are highly abundant, they are removing more of the consumption with less production. So that says, it just says that they're eating more, they're putting more pressure on that ecosystem, and it's less in Yellowstone in black, you can see when elk were abundant. So what we really want to notice here is the slope of these curves, or the slope of these lines. And you can see that Great Sand Dunes is very similar and less than where Yellowstone is at today. And we tend to think of Yellowstone National Park as being a well-managed, thriving ecosystem. So it's nice to be able to compare Great Sand Dunes to Yellowstone. And lastly, I want to compare these Great Sand Dunes with some places in Africa. So again, we have our two slopes with the proportion of consumption relative to production from Great Sand Dunes in red and blue. And then if we look at Laikipia, which is in Laikipia is in Africa, and they have antelope, cattle, and zebra, and they're in green. And if you look at the slope of that line, that is actually steeper than both of our slopes from Great Sand Dunes. And the same thing with the Serengeti, which has wildebeest, zebra, and antelope. So if we compare it to that grazing ecosystem, again, the Serengeti, which is, been a successful grazing ecosystem for, eons, that system is has more ungulate consumption relative to production than we have at Great Sand Dunes. So essentially, plant overcompensation was found in the Great Sand Dunes ecosystem, primarily in the wetter areas. But it did occur in the lowest productivity sites too, such as in the willow communities, and it even happened with 2 large herbivores. So that gives us some benchmark of, or a little bit of feedback, like, okay, what's actually going on here? To get back to this idea of how do you define, and how does the Park Service and how does the Fish and Wildlife Service, how do these managers go out and figure out, do we have too many ungulates on the landscape? And there was evidence for equal compensation as well, but there was very little evidence for undercompensation in the Great Sand Dunes ecosystem. So plants seemed to be tolerating the level of grazing that was occurring at the time of the study. And particularly, this is true for the ecosystems that I measured. One thing that I want to mention, though, is that we didn't do a lot of work in the greasewood and rabbit community. So those upland areas may be vulnerable due to the lower moisture inputs and lower herbaceous productivity, but they're a large part of the ecosystem out there. And it may be that they are having some effects from grazing because the grazers are out there as well. And we weren't able to measure this, at least not when I was doing my dissertation work, because we only had so much money. And the Park Service at that time was very concerned about their cottonwood sites. We also measured cottonwoods and the willow sites and the riparian areas. And we just couldn't do as much work in the greasewood and rabbitbrush sites. But we are hoping to start some new work in those areas shortly. And yeah, I'd love to talk to this group if anybody is interested in coming out and assisting with field work, field volunteering, to go out and clip plants and just be out on the ground with us. So when we compared these other grazed ecosystems relative to overgrazing, we didn't really find a lot of overgrazing going on in Great Sand Dunes. And this is partly because patchiness in ecosystems supports biodiversity. And the fact that there are some areas that may be grazed very heavily doesn't mean that that's what's going on across the whole ecosystem. And in fact, ecosystems that have some areas that are very heavily grazed are healthy ecosystems. We know from some other work that different bird species need different heights of grasses. They need basically grazing in some areas to be able to reproduce and have nest success. And they can't do it if there's too much grass and if there's too much foliage that hasn't been grazed. So there's this interesting balance between grazing and biodiversity, where this patchiness is what really supports biodiversity. So that's all I have. I think I'm catching us up on a little bit on time. Francis Singer was my boss, and I'd like to dedicate this talk to him and Dr. Dave Swift, who recently passed away. They were both, well, Francis passed away at the beginning of the study, and Dr. Swift was on my committee and passed away recently, and they were really terrific. And then I also am very grateful to Fred Bunch and Art Hutchinson, who was the superintendent at the time. Steve Cheney was there when we started. Phyllis Panetta-Bovine was at the park, and she's now gone. Andrew Valdez, I think, is still at the park. I also want to thank Chris Pegg and Paul Robertson of the Nature Conservancy. Ron Garcia and Mike Blendon of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service gave tremendous support on the Baca National Wildlife Refuge. And then Doug Frank gave us his data for Yellowstone National Park And I'm also grateful to Katie Hagman, Zach Wiebe, and John Wanzel, who really led a lot of the field data collection. And there was a tremendous amount of field work that we had to do. The project was funded by NRPP, and in-kind support was provided by TNC, the National Wildlife Refuge, and by My Science Center. This work has already been published, and so this is the citation for the work. My dissertation is also published that talks about willow communities, and there's some other things in there if you're interested. You can also reach out to me if you would like any of these materials at schoeneckerk@usgs.gov, or maybe you can contact Maggie and she can probably put you in touch with me. And if you have any additional questions, or you'd like to get involved in potentially some of the new work that we're starting, that would really be terrific. So thank you very much.